Hello everyone, I hope today finds you well. I came across an op-ed the other day in the Deseret News, a Salt Lake City-based newspaper. The title of the op-ed was, "In Our Opinion, Give Solar a Chance," with the subtitle, "Don't Cripple This Promising and Growing Industry." Now I happen to work in the energy industry, and in the renewable energy industry specifically. I feel like there's a lot of misconceptions by the general public about solar and wind power and their effects on the grid as a whole. So I wanted to use this op-ed as a way to respond to some of those misconceptions. This video is going to be a little bit different in that I haven't scripted this out like I have my previous videos, so I apologize if this starts to get a little rambly. I'm just trying a new format. So with that, let's get into this. In the past several months, various stakeholders have debated the merits of Rocky Mountain Power's proposal to raise monthly rates on future rooftop solar customers in Utah. Both sides make strong arguments, and a compromise between the two industries should be reached. Yet policymakers and rate setters should avoid actions that would significantly cripple the rooftop solar industry before it fully matures. Before it fully matures? According to the Department of Energy's History of Solar, photovoltaic cells were invented in 1954. How long does it take for an industry to mature? These things have been around for over 60 years now. Now you may think, oh well, they weren't really used for anything until much later. And to a degree that is true. The first utility-scale solar plant was installed in 1982. That's also the first time that there was a solar power car that drove. But let's compare this to a couple other fledgling industries in the 80s. Cell phones. A 1982 cell phone looked like this, compared to the type of cell phones that we have today, which are more personal computers than they are cell phones at this point. The ability of the device to make a phone call seems to be secondary now on today's smartphones. And mentioning personal computers, this was the personal computer that was available in 1982, the Commodore 64. So how much has that advanced in the last 40 years? Intensifying battles over solar energy are a clear indication that the solar industry is slowly yet surely coming of age after 60 years. And just as teenagers are eventually expected to give up the privileges and supports that protect them during their youth, this fledgling industry must also eventually transition to full contributor status. What other industries are there that are under some sort of a protectionary bubble or umbrella? The two industries that I cited earlier, computers and cell phones, they did not have any protection. They had to stand on their own merits. They had to grow on their own. They didn't need any sort of a crutch the way that solar energy does. The timing of this transition should be the essence of today's solar energy debates, and the Beehive State has to get this transition right in order to drive key energy and environmental outcomes for years to come. Utilities, such as local electricity, have long held what amounts to government-sanctioned monopoly. No, it's not what amounts to a government-sanctioned monopoly. It is a government-sanctioned monopoly. It's also a natural monopoly, which is why it is very heavily regulated. Utilities are incredibly regulated. There is a Public Utilities Commission that overlooks the rates of all of these utilities. It overlooks the reliability and the safety of these utilities. There are other government and semi-government bodies, such as FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and NERC, the North American Electrical Reliability Council, that produce all sorts of regulations that are put on utilities to make sure that they provide the best energy possible at fair rates. While there have been some modest attempts at making electric service more competitive, rooftop solar technology may represent the first viable challenge to the incumbent electricity suppliers. If it's a viable challenge, then why is it still being subsidized heavily? It and other alternative energy technologies may represent to the electric power industry what cell phones represented to the telephone industry. A transforming innovation. It's worth noting that cell phones were prohibitively expensive until innovation brought the technology to viable maturity. This analogy of cell phones versus landlines is completely false. Cell phones were independent from landlines. You didn't need your landline in order to use your cell phone. But with rooftop solar setups, you still need the electrical grid. You're utterly dependent upon the interconnection. If today you went to a solar installer and said, I'd like to put solar on my home, they would say there are 3 different configurations of solar that you can use. There's the grid-tied system, where when your panels are generating electricity more than what you are consuming, that electricity is put onto the grid. When you are consuming more electricity than your panels are creating, you are pulling electricity from the grid. This is the most common type of solar setup. However, when the power goes out, your solar panels shut off. You cannot operate without being connected to the grid. And when the grid is down, you are down also. There's also the grid-tied system with battery backup. Same as the grid-tied system, except there's also batteries attached to it. So if your power goes out, you switch over to the battery backup. But your panels are still tied to the grid. They are not tied to the batteries. So if your power goes out, your panels will not recharge the batteries. They will not provide you any electricity. You are solely dependent upon the batteries until the utility restores your electricity. The final system is the off-grid system. And an off-grid system, you are not connected to the interconnection in any way. You can't tie into it because your system is designed to be wholly self-sufficient. People who have off-grid systems have to make compromises though, because the solar panels and the batteries that they are connected to cannot provide the amount of current and the voltage that is often required by today's modern appliances. So you are constantly searching for things that use as little power as humanly possible, and you become an energy miser, making sure lights are always off, that you're never consuming any more power than you absolutely have to. Because if you have several days where it's overcast, where it's raining, if it snowed and you have snow on your panels, those batteries are going to run down and you're going to be left in the dark. And you can't just flop over to the utility grid. That is the advantage of having the grid, is that it is providing you with power 24/7, no matter what. And when there is a power outage, there are crews at the ready who go out, whether it's rain or shine, day or night, holidays, and they start working to get you your power back. There will come a time when solar will have to stand on its own. Now is not that time. Sensible financial and regulatory supports, including subsidized use of the grid, should be preserved as this industry continues to innovate and mature. The proposed electric rate structure could effectively shut down the solar industry in the state. Rocky Mountain Power is asking the Public Service Commission to approve charging new solar panel customers a $15 monthly rate for costs such as customer service and meter reading, as well as steeper energy use charges and a one-time application fee of $60 to cover administrative costs. In short, the math for many potential solar panel customers doesn't work out. That's because rooftop solar panel setups lean on the grid heavily. And when you install one of these systems and have your electric rates go down, you are shifting the burden of using the grid onto your neighbors who don't have a solar setup. This used to not be a big deal for utilities because there weren't very many people who were putting solar panels on their homes. But with the flood of cheap solar panels that has come in from China in the last couple years, there have been a lot more people who are putting it on, and the utilities are seeing that this is starting to have an effect, that they're having to pay for not just meter reading and customer service, but they have to maintain the electrical lines, the transformers, the relays, the switches, the circuit breakers, all these things that make sure that you still have electricity at all times. That costs money. So the fact that Rocky Mountain Power is asking for only $15 a month of rooftop solar customers, I think is actually a very, very modest request, because they are spending far more than that on a per customer basis to make sure that you get your electricity at all times. To be sure, the efforts of Rocky Mountain Power to insist on a more level playing field are sound, and some modest changes may be in order. Net metering and demand charges have real-world cost and revenue implications for incumbent suppliers, and often those costs get passed on to consumers, many of whom could not afford rooftop power. Exactly, and that's what Rocky Mountain Power is trying to address by doing these rate changes. When you put solar on your roof, you shift the burden of paying for the interconnection onto your neighbors who might not be able to afford to put solar on their own homes. However, the rooftop solar industry is far from reaching diminished returns in its efficiency and innovation, and its potential long-term benefits to household budgets and the environment are likely significant. In one of the most sunny states in the nation, the industry deserves the opportunity to continue to innovate while also being held accountable to demonstrate that those innovations are sustainable and scalable on their own merits over the long term. Buzzword, buzzword, I want my neighbors to subsidize my electricity use. Rocky Mountain Power contends that rooftop solar customers are using the grid without paying their fair share of costs, which they're not. This may be true. It is true. Yet the industry offers the promise of bringing Utah customers an appealing alternative that may, over time, greatly reduce the economic and environmental costs of energy. Utah would be wise to give it time. How much time do these people need? Earlier in this article, they referred to solar as being a teenager. No, it was a teenager in the 80s when computers and cell phones were teenagers also. But computers and cell phones grew up, became functioning adults, got married, and had a baby called the smartphone. Solar, meanwhile, is still living at home, the utility's home. It's living in its mother's basement, all the while sprinkling small amounts of rat poison in its mother's food, hoping someday mom will keel over so that it can take over the house without having to earn it. But since solar doesn't have a job, it won't be able to manage the house once it takes over. I'm actually not anti-solar. I think there is a great potential for solar to be used in the future, but it needs to have to innovate through competition, and it will never have to make great strides and grow unless it has to compete on a level playing field. I think utilities need to take a different tact, and I doubt that the public service commissions would allow them to do this, but I really think that they need to split up their rate charges. They need to charge two different electric rates to people. One is the rate for the actual power that they provide, and then they also need to charge a rate specifically for connection to the grid, because that is a significant portion of the cost of your electric bill, and people need to divorce this idea from this is the cost of electricity being your electric rate, because it's not. Most of the cost that you are paying is making sure that you have reliable electricity at all times, which is something that the current generation of rooftop solar just cannot provide. I hope this has given you something to think about, maybe a little bit different of a perspective. I'd love to hear your feedback and your comments, so please let me know what you think. I'm the Fox, and that's what the Fox said.